Alright YouTube, so we're back, of course, to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake, but we are, of course, discussing FF7 Original as well in this video, and we are revisiting the topic of Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge and their fate when it comes to Remake, but I want to do it a little bit differently, because we definitely talked about Jessie quite a bit on the channel, her fate, what happened with her, is she alive, is she dead, but I want to talk about the group as a whole, and whether or not them potentially living when it comes to the Remake story is actually anything new. Which obviously sounds kind of crazy, because for the better part of 25 years now, we've been talking about Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge dying during Platefall. The thing is, however, we don't necessarily have confirmation of that. It's obviously heavily implied that they died. Whether or not it's them succumbing to their wounds or the destruction of Sector 7, we believe that they have died. The main thing here that's important is that our group thinks that they're dead. But if you just look at the original FF7 by itself, no outside materials or whatever the case, we don't have confirmation, because we see them on our way up to the top of the pillar, it gets destroyed, we zipline away to Sector 6 slums, and we pretty much just leave Midgar, right? We go, obviously, to Elmire's house, see Marlene, head straight to the Shinra building, and then we leave Midgar, and we're outside of Midgar for the majority of the rest of the FF7 story. We come back in briefly later on in a mission, and then we leave again, right? We never have the confirmation. We never see the body, so to speak. And for the most part, when it comes to Remake, that's still the same. We obviously haven't got outside the walls of Midgar yet, but our group, for the most part, thinks that Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge are dead, up until we revisit the Sector 7 slums and obviously find Wedge in the underground lab or whatever. But even then, our group doesn't know for sure that Wedge is going to live, right? They take him back to Elmire's, but for all they know, when they're gone at the Shinra building, he could succumb to his wounds and die, which is why it's so surprising whenever he does show up at the Shinra building later on. Now, outside of the original Final Fantasy VII, I don't know if there's any confirmation, really, that Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge are dead. Now, there might be an Ultimania out there, like the Ultimania Omega or something like that, that confirms this, but I wouldn't know that because those have never been translated into English, and while they have been translated by fans, I don't know if they've got to that point yet. Whatever the case, I'm not sure. That, of course, might be out there somewhere. I'm not entirely sure. I tried to get an answer before actually making this video, but to no avail, so here we are. There is one place that I know confirms that they are dead, but the canon of this thing is very much in debate. And this, of course, would be the maid who travels the planet, or Hoshi o Meguru Atome, something along those lines. I don't know. I'm probably butchering the fuck out of that. To give you a bit of a terrible TLDR on this short story or whatever, it's Aerith in the live stream. It's from her death all the way up to the end of the original FF7, and she meets different characters throughout the story: Jessie, Biggs, Wedge, President Shinra, Hojo, Dyne, stuff like that. It's interesting conceptually, but there's some inconsistencies with like lore, because there's like, it's essentially like a heaven and hell situation. And pretty much if you're a bad person or you did bad things in your life, you don't join up with the live stream, which is why she comes across like Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge, because obviously they've killed innocent people with their bombings and stuff in the original FF7, so I'm assuming that's why they didn't join up the live stream. But it's very inconsistent with some later lore we get, where like with like live stream Black and stuff like that on the way to a smile, where like Sephiroth had to like fucking fight to not join up the live stream. Like he had to latch himself on his entire being onto Cloud just so he wouldn't join up with the planet. So it doesn't make sense why Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge would just be chilling down there. Also, with this particular story, and we're not getting into the shipping discussions, I'm just telling it like it is, they make Aerith like super jealous of like Tifa and Cloud, and then within the live stream, like Aerith pretty much wants nothing to do with Zack. She doesn't seem to like Zack. But to be fair, the story did come out like a couple years before Crisis Core, and even with the original FF7, they didn't really make Zack and Aerith all that close. Like it's kind of ambiguous how close they were, versus if you actually play Crisis Core, they were very much into each other. And lastly, and for me the most important thing when it comes to the discussion of the canon of this story, is that it wasn't written by Nojima. It was written by some guy. That's the best description I can give you. Some guy named Benny Matsuyama, which is somebody that works for the people that at the time made the Ultimanias and shit like that. And for whatever reason, Akira Yamashita, which I'll be honest, I don't know if I've ever even heard that name. I don't know who that is in terms of Square Enix or Squaresoft at the time, whatever it was, allowed this person to write a short story for the Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega. I don't know why. This wasn't even like a year or two after FF7 came out, right? We're talking like 05. This is a story that came out damn near a decade after the original FF7. So why they wouldn't have Nojima write it, I don't know. But putting aside this obscure novella that was in an Ultimania Omega, you know, fucking 17 years ago at this point, or whatever the case, everything FF7 ever, the entirety of the compilation, from the games to Advent Children to the goddamn books, Traces to Pass, On the Way to a Smile, The Kids Are Alright, Turk Side Story, like everything has been Nojima, except for this one particular story. And that alone for me makes it not canon, at least for me as a fan. And the point of bringing all this up is that, as I mentioned previously, she comes across Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge within this story. And this would be confirmation, if the book was canon to the original FF7, that they did in fact die, because obviously they're in the goddamn live stream. And to kind of fully wrap it around to what I mentioned earlier in the video is if you just play the original Final Fantasy VII and that's it, you don't look for the Ultimanias or research online or anything like that, you don't have confirmation of their death. More than likely they fucking died. I'm not arguing that point yet, because they probably did. But you don't know for sure, right? That's the thing. There's the ambiguity there. And with that not knowing in mind, if we hop to the remake version of Platefall, the events that take place in this game more or less kind of confirm that they didn't die here. The entire purpose of the Whispers is to make sure that what took place in the original FF7 takes place during Remake. So if they were meant to die here, then why the hell didn't they? It's a very simple process, a very simple equation, right? But Biggs is wounded here in this scene, but at the end of the game, we see him wake up, right? Presumably surviving and not dying this time. But that's like another day or two later. Like, we go to Elmira's house after Platefall, right? We stay the night there. We wake up, we travel to the Shinra building, it's dark by the time we get there, and by the time we get to the end of the highway and Sephiroth stuff, it's like daytime again, right? And then we see Biggs wake up. So it's been like a whole day or two. So something's not adding up here, because if he was meant to die during the destruction of the Sector 7 plate, then why didn't the Whispers enforce that? So there's potentially one or two things the devs are trying to tell us here. It's either that Biggs and Wedge, and potentially Jessie as well, didn't die in the original FF7, despite us thinking that, we just leave Midgar, we never knew the truth. Or that they were meant to succumb to their wounds at a later point, which is why you're seeing Biggs laid up in bed a couple days later, but he survives because we destroy the Whispers. Another thing that kind of leans in favor of them not dying here in this moment is whenever you actually see the plate collapse, like, there's a gigantic piece of rubble that's falling towards Wedge. How would that not kill him? Like, it's almost like the Whispers themselves maybe intervened to make sure that he didn't die, because if that fell on top of him, it wouldn't just put a hole in the ground to a lab, he'd be fucking dead. And that's the thing here, too, is like Wedge is this weird anomaly when it comes to the Whispers because he survives that gigantic piece of rubble falling on him, but also he survives like the fall from the tower. Obviously, the grapple guns are a newer thing when it comes to Remake, but in the original FF7, that's more than likely what killed him, right? Like, he falls from a very high point on the tower, the very top of the tower, in fact, and lands completely flush on the ground. Like, this would break probably most of the bones in his body, and this would probably be the wounds that he would later succumb to. Like, this is almost definitely what actually killed him in the original FF7. But he survives that. We see him on screen survive that. But not only that, he later travels all the way to the Shinra building, somehow unnoticed by the Whispers, calls in backup from the other Avalanche cells and groups and shit like that, and even infiltrates the Shinra building up to a very high floor before the Whispers even take notice. Like, it kind of doesn't make sense. They seem to be omnipotent pretty much all the time. They're everywhere all the time, making sure shit happens like it's supposed to. But if Wedge was supposed to die at the Sector 7 collapse, then why is he here right now? Doesn't make sense. The thing is, when it comes to the ending of Remake, if we go with the idea that Zack survived, you can make sense of how that happened and why that happened. Our group, the main group, Cloud and everybody, is inside the Singularity trying to destroy and eradicate the Whispers. So that would pretty much be an all-hands-on-deck situation. We need every Whisper inside the Singularity trying to stop these guys, or we're all going to die. So they're no longer over where Zack is, whether that's in the past, a separate timeline, whatever the case. They're no longer over here to make sure that he dies in this moment when he's supposed to, and then, of course, our group in the Singularity kills the Whispers, so then he ends up surviving. But if we jump over to the Sector 7 collapse, the Whispers aren't distracted or busy by some impending threat trying to wipe them out, right? It's just them making sure that FF7 story happens like it's supposed to. Also, if Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge were meant to die in this moment, why wouldn't the Whispers be going a little bit harder to make sure that that happens? I mean, look at what they went through just to make sure that Jessie gets injured and Cloud goes on the Sector 5 reactor mission. Like, they swarmed the entirety of the Sector 7 slums. Here's what I think's going on here, and this is just pure speculation on my end. Whether or not they did or didn't die in the original game, whether or not they are supposed to die, doesn't really matter. Like, their deaths do not really matter. All that actually matters is that our group thinks that they died. That's all that they need. It's just further motivation for our group to want to take down Shinra because of all the shit that Shinra does, but also they killed Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge as far as we knew. That's all that needs to happen. So maybe the Whispers aren't actively trying to kill Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge, because they should in these moments, but they're not doing that clearly. So maybe they're just trying to keep up with the facade that they died. Whether or not they actually do, it doesn't really matter, because our group needs to think that they're dead so they go to the goddamn Shinra building. They're already chasing after Aerith as well anyways, but they need that motivation because their friends just goddamn died. And given that Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge are side characters both in this game and also the original FF7, maybe the Whispers aren't always watching them, and that could explain how, like, Wedge was able to work his way all the way from Elmira's house to the Shinra building. But then you fall into, like, some other weird discussions, like, why did they even allow us to get to the underground lab to find Wedge? That doesn't even make sense. Like, that's not something that happened in the original FF7. I know they're expanding shit to make it a more modern game, make it a more fleshed out game, and add in shit from the expanded lore of the compilation and stuff. But, like, whenever we get back to the Sector 7 slums, they should, for one, at all times be watching Barrett, Tifa, and Cloud. How would they even allow us to go back and dig through the rubble and find Wedge's body? It just doesn't make sense. It's like there's such an inconsistency with how the Whisperers work. Because going back to the original Final Fantasy VII, our group thinks that they are dead, and more than likely all three of them are dead in the original game, right? So why would they allow us to come upon the truth that Wedge survived? Like, why would they even let us do that? Like, it just doesn't make sense. But also maybe, and we're just kind of diving down the rabbit hole at this point, maybe the Whisperers don't really care. Like, they only care about, like, the important people and characters that keep the FF7 story in line. Maybe they just don't give a shit about Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge. It doesn't matter whether they live or die, because they're not going to impact the overall story. They're not going to be fighting Sephiroth alongside us, essentially, and shit like that, right? You also have the question of, okay, so Biggs and Jessie survived, but, like, who got them off the tower? Who saved them? Who saved them before the tower started collapsing, right? Like, that had to have happened. Or maybe they, like, got buried in the rubble but didn't die from it somehow. Somebody retrieved their bodies, but, like, whoever saved them had to get them 2 goddamn sectors over, because they're in Sector 7 slums, and Biggs wakes up into the Sector 5 orphanage, right? That's 2 whole sectors over, so that had to be a strong son of a bitch to be able to get them all the way over there. It couldn't just be some random person. Somebody drug a dead weight person, possibly 2 people, all the way 2 sectors over. So that had to be a strong motherfucker. I don't know who it would be. This shit's really fun to discuss, my dudes, but, like, there's so many unanswered questions and so many inconsistencies, especially with how the Whisperers work. But, like, when it comes to, you know, Biggs surviving at the end of Remake, it's like, we're going to have a flashback on that, right? They're going to have to show us how that happened and who that was, how the hell he got all the way to Sector 5 orphanage and shit like that, right? The ending montage that we get is something that we kind of take at face value, but we don't really know what it is. We don't know if it's out of context. We don't know if it's happening in a different timeline, potentially, right? Because that's, again, that's the thing. There could maybe be multiple timelines in this game. So the Biggs that we're seeing wake up in the bed might not be the same Biggs that was on the tower, necessarily. I'm not going to go too deep in on that. It's just a random idea that I've heard before that I thought was kind of interesting. The possibility that what we're seeing is like Zack's altered timeline, where maybe like Biggs was always meant to survive. Like that could be a Biggs that survived the Sector 7 platefall, but in the remake timeline that we played, Biggs still died, essentially. This video is getting long as hell, so to kind of wrap it all up, the TLDR on this whole video, this 12, 13-minute video, whatever it's been, is that if they were meant to die during the Sector 7 playfall, then the Whisperers would have made sure that happened, but it doesn't. We see Biggs wake up at the end of the game, potentially. Our Biggs, could be a different Biggs. We see Wedge multiple times survive shit in Remake that doesn't make any sense. It makes it all the way to the Shinder building before the Whisperers drag him out the window for him to still probably survive. I suppose Jessie's fate is still kind of up in the air. I personally think that she's dead, but other people think that she'll make a return, maybe at the Gold Saucer or something like that, whatever the case. But as I said previously in the video, their deaths don't really matter. They don't have to die for the Final Fantasy VII story to play out the same. All that really needs to happen is that our group needs to think that they're dead for motivation. But my dudes, I think it's going to be pretty much the video. Hopefully this is the last time we kind of talk about this shit for a little while until maybe there's something a little more concrete. But I had somebody hit me up on Twitter about this, about how when it comes to the original FF7, it's not really confirmed. We don't have the confirmation of that. And I was like, fuck it. It's something I've been saying for a while. I've talked about it a little bit on the channel, but I figured let's do another video. So, of course, pass off to you guys. What are your thoughts when it comes to the fate of Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge in Remake? Do they even really have to die? Whether that's because they maybe didn't die in the original, or because their deaths really aren't all that important anyways. So, of course, pass off to you guys. What are your thoughts when it comes to the fate of Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge in Remake? Do they even really have to die? Whether that's because they maybe didn't die in the original, or because their deaths really aren't all that important anyways. My dudes, that's the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, give a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new to today more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter @YT. I'm a Discord. Links to social networks are in the description. Into the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.